Alright guys, in the last video we created a payment page for buying a React course, which of course you could put any product here, and it goes through and gets submitted to our charge.php, which uses the Stripe API. It creates a customer and then it charges the customer and sends them to a success page. So now what I want to do is implement a database and just more, I want to add more to our back end. I want to add some models so that we can submit the data we want to our own database. And then after that, we'll move on to create a couple pages where we can view the transactions and so on in our own application. So first thing we're going to do here is create our database. So I'm using PHP MyAdmin. So I'm going to go to localhost PHP MyAdmin, and this comes with XAMPP if that's what you're using. If you want to use a different database client or if you want to use your SQL shell, that's fine as well. Okay, but I'm doing it the easy way, which is through a GUI program. So let's create a database called PayPage. And we're going to have two tables. First is going to be customers. And let's see, as far as fields, we want 5 fields, I believe. Okay, so we're going to have an ID. The ID is actually going to be a varchar. This is going to be the the customer ID from Stripe. I'm going to say 255 max. And let me make this a little bigger. This is going to be the primary key, so I'm going to choose primary, but it's not going to be auto increment, so don't check the AI. And then the second field here is going to be the first name, first underscore name, which will be varchar, last name, email, and let's also do a created at, and that's going to be a date time, which is right here, date time, and I'm going to choose a default of the current timestamp. So that'll get automatically inserted. So let's save that. That's our first table. Let's go back to our database and create a new table called transactions. And this is going to have, let's see, this is going to have quite a few more fields. It's going to have 7. And it's going to have an ID, which will be a varchar 255, and this is also going to be the primary key but not auto increment because it's going to be the actual transaction ID from Stripe. Then we're going to have the customer underscore ID. We're going to have the product, which will be the product name or the description. We're going to have the amount that it costs. I'm just doing everything as varchar. We're going to have the currency. We're going to have the status. And then we're going to do a created at, which will be date time and current timestamp as the default. And there's a lot of other stuff. You saw the response that we get back from Stripe. There's a lot of other stuff you could store, but I don't want to go too crazy here. I think this is good enough. So now that we have our tables, we want to start to implement our models. But before we do that, we need a way to access our database. Okay, so we're going to use PDO. And let's see, let me just go to my gist real quick. I'm not going to type out the entire, where is it? So right here, I'll have the link in the description, by the way, for this. This is a class that implements PDO, which is PHP Data Objects. It's the best way to connect to a database through PHP. In my opinion, it's better than using MySQL or MySQL Improved. Basically, we have a bunch of properties here. That's going to be your host, your user, database user, password, database name. This stuff will all come from a config file that we'll create. And then it has a database handler, an error property, and a statement property because PDO uses prepared statements. And if you know nothing about PDO, I would suggest watching my PDO crash course. That takes you from knowing nothing about it to knowing all about prepared statements and all that stuff. Okay, so in our constructor, we're creating our DSN, which is just basically a connection string, some options that have to do with persisting the error mode and all that. And then here we're creating a new PDO instance, passing in our DSN, the user, the password, all that. So this is what's connecting to our database using PDO. Then we just have a simple query function that will prepare a statement. We have our bind function that will bind our values, and execute, which will execute result set. That's if you want to fetch data and you want to return an array, or I'm sorry, yeah, an array of objects. Single, which will return a single object. Row count will count your rows, and then if you want the last inserted ID, you can get that as well. But we're not even going to be using these. We're actually not going to be using any of these functions here. All right, just these ones. But what I'll do is just grab all this. Okay, and if you took my PHP MVC course on Udemy, this is the exact same class. So you're probably familiar with it already. So what I'll do is create a folder called lib, because it's basically what this is a library, and I'm going to create a file called PDO_db.php, and then we're going to paste that in. Alright, so we'll save that, and then this is what we're going to use in our models to interact with our database. Now we're going to need a config file with all of our database parameters, so I'm going to create another folder called config, and then in there I'll create a file called db.php. Okay, and inside here, let's see, we're actually going to define some constants. So these will be our db params. So let's define a constant of db_host, and our host, of course, is going to be localhost. And then we're going to have 4 of these. So this one is going to be our db user. So this is your database username. I'm using my root user. Then we have our db pass. So your password, which mine is just 1 through 6, and then you want your DB name, which I called paypage. Okay, and that's it. So we'll save that. So now our database library is all set. Our parameters are in our config file. Now we just need to include those inside of our charge.php file. All right, so let's go right under here, and we'll say require once, and we want the config first, so config db.php, and then we want our lib/pdo_db.php. Okay, make sure you have the config first, because the database library needs to read the parameters from the config file. Alright, so now that we did that, we're going to start to create our models. So let's say new folder, call it models, and I'm going to create a file called customer.php. Okay, models should be singular. Let's also create a file called transaction.php. And I like to have my models capitalized as well. Alright, so we'll start with the customer. So we'll have a class called customer. And we're going to be using our PDO library. So I'm going to create a private property called DB. Okay, and then we're going to create our constructor. So in PHP, to create a constructor, you do _construct. And a constructor is just a function or method that runs when your object is instantiated. And all we want to do here is instantiate our database. So we're going to take that DB property, we can access properties with this. So this DB, we want to set it to new database, okay? Because database is the name of the class, our database class. So if we look at our PDO file, you'll see we have class database. So all we're doing is instantiating this class or this object. All right, so let's go back to customer, and that's all we want to do in our construct function. So next thing we want is a function to add a customer. So we'll say public function add customer, and then this is going to take in some data. Okay, and we're going to do all this in the charge.php. We're going to instantiate this class and then call this add customer and pass what we need in. All right, and what's going to be passed in this data array, this is going to be an array. It's going to have the ID, the first name, the last name, and the email. So what we want to do is then say this. Actually, let's put a comment here. We'll say prepare query. So we're going to say this DB. Remember, when we use this DB, we can access anything that's in this database class. So we want to call the query method, which is right here. Okay, we want to prepare our statement. So let's say this DB query, and then all we have to do is pass in our query, which is going to be insert into customers, the table customers, and then our fields, we're going to insert our ID, first name, last name, and email. All right, and then we want to say values. Now the values we're going to bind, we're going to use named parameters here. So we want to do colon ID, colon first name, colon last name, and colon email. All right, so this is, we're binding our data here. This is a secure way to work with your database. Now, up to this point, it doesn't know what we want to bind. There should be no space here. It doesn't know what we want to bind, so this is where we call our database bind method, which if we look in our PDO file, we have right here. So we want to call this and bind our data. So we're going to go back and we're going to say bind values. So we'll say this DB bind, and we want to bind to the ID, colon ID, which is our named parameter, and we want to bind from the data array the ID field that's being passed in right here. Okay, we want to do the same for the others, so let's do 4 of these. So in addition to ID, we're going to have first name, oops, and we're going to have last name, and we're going to have email. All right, so once we bind it, we want to execute it. So we're going to say if, we're going to put this in an if statement and say if this DB, okay, remember we can access anything in that DB, and we want to access execute. So if this is executed, then let's just return true. Whoops. Else, let's return false, and that's it. That should add it to our database. Now, of course, we need to call this add customer. We need to call this from our charge. So after we do our Stripe charge, let's go down right here, and this is where we're going to do it. Now, since we're using object-oriented programming, we're using classes, we need to instantiate the customer object from that class. So let's say instantiate customer, and before I do that, I actually need to bring in the customer file, the model. So let's say require once. So we want models/customer. All right, and let's go back down, and then we can simply do let's say customer equals new customer, like that. And then what we want to do is call the add customer method. So we can take that customer object and we can call add customer. Now we want to put in here our customer data, which we haven't created yet. So let's do that. I'm actually going to do that up here. So we'll say customer data. So it'll be a variable called customer data. We'll set it to an array, and we're going to have an ID, and we're going to get that from the, remember we get that charge object back, and we want to get the customer from that. So that's what we're going to use as the ID. And then the rest of the stuff, like the first name, this is stuff that's coming from our form. It's not actually coming back from the charge object. So we can just put in first name like that. And you can have any fields. If you wanted to have the address come in or any other fields inside of our form here, you could put anything you want, okay, and store it in your database. You're not limited to what comes back from your charge object. So let's say last name and email. Okay, so that's our customer data. We're instantiating the customer object, and then we're calling add customer. So that should do it as far as just adding the customer. It's not going to add the transaction yet. We haven't done that, but let's test that part out. Okay, so let's reload here. Let me just double check. Make sure you have your config, your database library, and your model. So we'll go ahead and say, I don't know, Sally Williams. Let's try it out. Okay, so that worked out. Now let's go to our database. Let's go to our customers table, and there it is. So for the ID, we have the ID that came back from the Stripe API, and we have the rest of the fields. And of course, like I said, you could have more if you wanted. And if we look in our dashboard in Stripe and reload, there it is right here, Sally's purchase. Okay, so it's going to both places. So now let's do our transactions. Now the transaction is going to work pretty much the same way. It just has different fields. So what I'll do is copy our customer model. So everything we have here inside customer PHP, I'm going to go into transaction PHP and paste it in. And then we're just going to change the class name. And then we want this stuff because we want to access the database library. We're going to change this to add transaction. We're going to get some data passed in. And then let's change the field. So we will have an ID. We can leave that. And then we're going to have the customer ID. We're going to have the product, the amount. So this is just all the stuff we added in the database. Currency and status. And then for the values, we want the same stuff, but we want to use the named parameters, which just have the colon in front. So like that, and oh, we want status as well. For some reason in VS Code the word status is blue. I think it's a reserved word or something, but it's not going to affect anything. Okay, now we just want to do the binding. So we want the ID, then we want the customer ID, which will be passed in. Whoops. Okay, next we want the product. And we want the amount. Oops. And we also want two more, which is going to be the currency. And we want the status. Like that. Okay, and then just run the execute. So let's save it. Let's go back to our charge.php and pretty much do the same thing we did for the customer. We want to create the data. So I'm going to copy this, this, and this. Paste it in. And we're just going to change up this to transaction data. Transaction data. So let's see, for the transaction ID, we don't want customer, we want ID. All right, and then this is going to be the customer ID, which comes from charge customer. And then we have the product, which comes from charge description. Okay, but in our database we're calling it product. And then we have our amount, which will come from charge amount. We also have status. Oops. And what else? Oh, I forgot currency, which I'm going to put here. All right, so that's our transaction data. Now we want to instantiate the transaction. So instead of new customer, we want new transaction. We'll change that to transaction. And we're going to call transaction add transaction and pass in the transaction data. So same thing, it's just different data. Okay, and I don't think we brought in the model, did we? No, we didn't. So let's just add that. Yep, so we'll bring in that model, and then we should have access to all of that. Good. So now when we make a payment, it should add it to both tables, unless hopefully I didn't misspell anything. I went kind of fast, but we'll check it out. But first thing I'm going to do is delete the customer Sally. And then I'm also going to go to my dashboard and just clear everything out. So I'll go to business settings, data, and let's delete all test data. Okay, and then we'll go to payments. It should be empty. Good. So let's try this again. So we'll go to our home page or pay page. Let's put in John Doe. Submit. Oh, okay, so we're getting an error, unknown column customer ID in field list. All right, let's check out. Now it did go into customers, but we had the error during the transaction. So let me look at the structure here. We have customer ID as a field. Let's look at this. Let's see, let's go to our model, our transaction model. Let's see. So ID, customer ID. Let me look at that error again. column not found, unknown column, customer ID in the field list, stack trace, charge 61. Right here. We're trying to insert into the customer's database. We want it to go into transactions. Okay, so what I'll do is just delete from our customer's database, the one we just added, John Doe. I'll just leave it in Stripe. But let's try this again, and hopefully it works. So we'll use a different name. We'll say Tom Smith. Submit. Alright, so that went through. So let's check our database. We'll look at our customers. So there's Tom Smith. Let's go to our transactions, and there it is. So we have our transaction ID, our customer ID, our product, our amount, currency, status is succeeded, and our created at. And if we go to our dashboard here, we'll see the John Doe that we did at first, and then we'll see the Tom at Gmail. Alright guys, so I'm going to stop the video here, and in the next one we're going to create the pages so that we can see our transactions and our customers in our application, so we don't actually have to go to the PHP MyAdmin or search the SQL shell or anything like that to see what we have. Alright, so thanks guys, and I will see you in the next video.